All right, so this meeting is being recorded, and we will share a link to it either later this week or early next week, and then we will also post it on our YouTube channel along with all of our other past Summit Speakers series. So please feel free to share any of these materials with your networks and speakers. If you have any materials that you want me to share out with this to our attendees, feel free to send anything like that my way, and I'm happy to. We will keep everybody on mute, so if you are not already on mute, we'll go through and just do that quickly in a moment. And we keep everybody on mute, including for the Q&A, which we use the chat box for. Patrick, if you don't mind switching to the next slide. If anyone's unfamiliar with how to use chat in Google Meets, this is how you do it. And I'll put our email address in there in a minute so you can see it as well. We'll start the Q&A at about 9:10 a.m., but at any point during the conversation, if you'd like to, you can type your questions into the chat. And we're starting basically a kind of a random winner. So if you ask questions in the chat, we'll select those to ask the speakers, and you will have the opportunity to potentially be selected as a random winner to get some cool local swag from our office. And with that, I'm actually going to go ahead and turn the time over to Pitt Gruey, who is our director, and he can introduce the panelists and then dive into the conversation. Pitt?
Thanks, India. I appreciate it. And thank you all for being here this morning. It's really great to see everybody, and I'm really excited about all of the panelists that we have and this important discussion. Obviously, public lands is a hot topic in Utah, always, and it's important that we educate ourselves, that we know how it works and how we can be involved and how we can, have the greatest impact to encourage recreation being a prime use of our public lands and work together with all the other users and everything else that goes on in our state. So I have the honor of introducing and moderating. So let's get started. Our first panelist is Katie Boué. Katie is a Cuban-American outdoor advocate who moved to Utah 4 years ago after falling in love with the state's desert terrain and public lands culture. She is the founder of Outdoor Advocacy Project, a community organization and consulting group aimed at activating outdoors to get educated and participate in issues affecting the outdoors. As a consultant, Katie has brought her social media expertise to organizations like Outdoor Alliance, Outdoor Industry Association, the American Alpine Club, and Public Land Solutions. In the media, she's been featured by CNN, Outside Magazine, Backpacker, The Denver Post, and more. So welcome, Katie. Next, we have Adriana Chimaras, and she was born in Venezuela and moved to Miami, Florida at a young age. And after attending art school, she moved to Portland, Oregon, where she fell in love with climbing and the outdoor industry. Shortly after her personal discovery of climbing in 2009, she decided to dive headfirst and live the van life, like most climbers often do. And so this is where she fell in love with Utah and outdoor recreation. So after a year on the road, decided to move to Salt Lake City and pursue a career in climbing and the outdoor industry. She decided to move to Salt Lake City. In this pursuit, it led her to become a climbing coach and one of the founders of the Joes Valley Festival. So starting the fest, whose mission is to enhance the local economy and build community by bringing rock climbers and locals together around our shared enthusiasm for the outdoors, is one of the proudest achievements and has created a new home for her. She now calls Emery County home, and it's where she works and her playground. And she's transitioned from Salt Lake City to Castledale, Utah, as the role of the Director of Tourism for Emery County. So welcome, Adriana. Next, we have Ashley Korenblat. And Ashley is currently the CEO of Western Spirit Cycling, an outfitter based in Moab, Utah, who runs multi-day bicycle trips throughout the U.S. and is one of the largest holders of recreational permits on the public land system. Western Spirit also produces Outer Bike, a consumer bike demo event. She was inducted into the Mountain Bike Hall of Fame in 2003. Ashley serves as the managing director for Public Land Solutions, a nonprofit working with communities transitioning from resource extraction to recreation. So she was appointed to the Utah BLM Resource Advisory Council for 2 terms, in addition to advisory boards for the Utah Governors Huntsman and Herbert, as well as Washington Governor Grigori. Next, we have Matt Blocker. So Matt was raised in Missoula, Montana by 2 Forest Service parents. He graduated from the University of Montana and started working for the Bureau of Land Management right away in 2005 as a seasonal park ranger in Prineville, Oregon. He's worked for the BLM in Oregon, Montana, California, and now Utah. And up until last week, he worked as the BLM Utah State Recreation and Visitor Service Lead. Now, this week, he started as the outdoor recreation planner with the headquarters office here in Salt Lake City. He's been working for the BLM since 2012 when he was an outdoor recreation planner in Price, Utah. And in his free time, he loves to get outside as much as possible on public lands, hiking, biking, and boating. So as you can see, we have quite the panel of experience here, and I expect us all to be enlightened and educated quite highly by all of these great resources that we have. And again, I thank them all for taking the time to be a part of this and this discussion. So let's get started. First question, I'm going to direct it towards Matt. But Matt, if you would, describe what a multiple use mission is as it relates to the Bureau of Land Management, and mention any, or if there are any differences between the Bureau of Land Management multi-use plans and Forest Service multi-use description.
Thank you, Pitt, and good morning to everybody. I see a lot of friends out there and definitely a lot of knowledge greater than me. So if I get any of this wrong, feel free to correct me. I see Chris Hartman with the Forest Service there. If I get anything wrong, and I'll try to stick with the BLM side of things. But as you can tell, there's a lot of similarities in the public land agencies, the Forest Service and the BLM. But the BLM, our multiple use mandate, came to us in 1976 from the Federal Lands Policy Management Act. That is what our founding document is that gives us our multiple use mandate for public lands. And the gist of multiple use for me is really a balancing act that we have to do every day with every single action that we do. And with that is multiple use and sustainable yield. That balancing act is finding the key points in where the resources, we have many resources on the land, the wildlife habitats, energy resources, timber resources, grazing, those sort of things. We have to balance the resource needs with the use. And that's where we're a little different than the Park Service or other agencies that don't have a multiple use mandate. We have to constantly have that balancing act between resources and uses of the land to determine what is best. And as I always say, these are your public lands. So that's where it's so important to be able to comment on what we want from these public lands, and how to do that responsibly, sustainably. So that's kind of where I see the multiple use mandate for the BLM. And it's remarkable if you look at I'm sure we copied the Forest Service, but if we look at the Forest Service and the BLM mission statement, it's almost identical. It's to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of public lands. So I don't know of any real differences. I know the Forest Service started a lot earlier in the game, and I think it was the Forest Service Management Act or the Forest Management Act that gave them their multiple use mandate. And feel free to correct me if I'm wrong there, but that was a lot earlier than the BLM. So there's more similarities than differences in our multiple use mandate. We manage different landscapes, and we acquired the public lands differently than the Forest Service, of course, but we're still both doing that juggling act between resources and uses and trying to find that balance of what can be sustainable. And one of the key points that all public land agencies have is that we're managing for the present and future generations. So we constantly have to keep that in mind as we're making these planning decisions based on public feedback and comments. So I think that kind of summarizes the multiple use mandate as far as I see it. And I don't know if Chris has anything to add from the Forest Service perspective or can or anything, but that's how I see it for the Bureau of Land Management.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that. So I kind of want to move this conversation forward a little bit and now put this how it applies to individuals and businesses and everything else in the industry. So Adriana, Katie, and Ashley, right? You all come from different backgrounds and careers, whether you're working in tourism or you're working in guides and outfitting operations or working in conservation efforts, right? So how would you describe, or how is your job is influenced by the multiple use mission lands mandate that Matt just described? And how does it affect your day-to-day in how you go about your job? And let's start with Adriana.
Hey, I guess for us, the hardest, probably the most challenging thing is trying to figure out how to keep good relationships with multi-users. For instance, hunters and climbers, or bikers and horseback riders. And I mean, there's never an easy answer. And we're pretty lucky in Emery County. We have a lot of land, and so people can really spread out. So education is generally number one. So hunters were really put off by the climbing festival happening on opening weekend of rifle hunting season one year. And so a lot of explanation went in to say, this is where, because people really didn't know where the climbers were in Joe's Valley and the canyons. And so we had to kind of point out, hey, this is where the climbers are actually, and this is generally where you're hunting. And so that's not actually happening in the same space. Or, climbers wear really colorful clothing. It's kind of hard to miss them. And creating things like the Joe's Valley Fest, where they get a chance to meet each other and realize that we're really not all that different. We want our space. We want our space to do what we like to do outside. And but really, it generally comes down to education, which is probably a really good segue for Katie, since she's nodding her head really hard.
Yeah, I'll take over now. I completely agree with everything you said, Adriana. And, for me, my job really is, the foundation is communication. And so I think the first step for me, because my audience is primarily a community of outdoor users, recreationalists. And so when they hear multiple use for the first time, a lot of what they think is, oh, like multiple activities. So there's climbing and biking and camping. And, don't even think about things like grazing or timber or, development for oil and gas. I have absolutely no clue what multiple use means. So it's really that, like, step one is understanding what multiple use means. And I think there's a huge opportunity within that communication to make sure that we're doing so in a way that facilitates a collective culture, so that we are establishing a community where outdoor recreationalists understand that they are in community with other multiple uses and not in competition with. It's trying to facilitate this collaborative space where we realize that we all care for these resources, we all cherish these resources, we use them in different ways, and we have different priorities and histories and backgrounds, but that these lands are a space where we can come together and collaborate. And honestly, to understand that recreation is not the only important thing that happens on public lands. I think, from a selfish perspective, climbers go out and they're like, oh, obviously climbing is the only important thing that happens here. But helping folks understand that our public lands are part of an ecosystem in our local communities, for our economies. It's a huge web. And so my job is really all focused around communicating those nuances within that web. And I think one of the first stops is helping folks understand what multiple use mission lands are, and the differences between them and what we can and can't do on different public lands. There's so much communication that needs to be done around it. And I've been doing this for 10 years and I'm still learning. So it's definitely a lifelong process, but we just want to get folks on that pathway to understanding, cherishing, and speaking up for their public lands.
So I'm going to do a 1-minute history of the public land system. And I'm going to miss a lot of things, but I think, when people first moved to the West, the only way to survive and make a living was to use the land. And for most of human history, in fact, the only way to make a living is to use the land, right? And so this idea of land in its natural state being an economic driver through recreation is a relatively new idea. And one of our challenges right now is, and for many people, traditionally, if you can imagine being in Utah 100, 150 years ago, first of all, if your family survived, you were smart and tough and used the land in a good way, right? And that self-reliance, that history and tradition of self-reliance is very strong in Utah. And because it was so focused on the land, the idea of public land, we created this sort of dichotomy where public land ownership was preventing private land ownership. And because land ownership is the best way to make a living in the most honest way, because everyone kind of felt like any other jobs are kind of like snake oil, right? Like tourism is a little bit like snake oil, but like mining and farming and ranching, that's an honest living. And that was true. I mean, you can see how people would feel that way. And so this change, as we look at economic prosperity coming from the shared access to public land through recreation. I mean, we know that Goldman Sachs and Adobe, they came to Utah because they can attract the most talented folks by bribing them with skiing before work, or that close access is a really important part of the Utah economy. So what does all that mean for the multiple use mandate? Because one of our challenges right now is that changes in the economy have happened faster than changes to the way we manage the land. I mean, we still have, the 1873, is that right? 73, 74, whatever, Mining Act, or mineral leasing. No, the mineral leasing is 1920. I know that one. So you've got these really old laws that are governing how the land managers have to act. And what that translates to is not the best decision-making process on the public land. So a great example is the oil and gas. There's an oil and gas lease sale every quarter now. That's the way the current Department of Interior is running it. And there'll be one that's slated for March. And we're learning about what parcels have been nominated, because the system allows the industry to say, hey, we'd like to drill over here and maybe over here. And so they've nominated some parcels, and some are in Emory County. And right now, we're also working hard to implement the Dingle Act and to and help. Emory County is looking to sort out its recreation assets and send people to the right places and not the wrong places, and make sure that when they go to these places, they're going to have a good experience. So what we have now is a system that sometimes creates these train wrecks, right? The oil and gas system is allowing these parcels to be nominated. Other people are working on where recreation should happen. What happens when they're in the same exact spot? And this is something that, as Katie was saying, the recreation community, has been very focused on their thing. I mean, the mountain bikers are really good at building trails. They are experts. They own that berm. They are there for that. And the climbers are really good at their part of everyone's, but getting all the recreation community to kind of lift up their heads and look at the bigger public land system is the challenge, because that's where we need to start facilitating these changes. I mean, the purpose of the public land is to meet the needs of the public, right? And it used to be like, well, everybody wants a hot shower, so getting coal for electricity is the highest and most important need for the public. But now, as we see that there are, other ramifications of using coal, and there are other needs and economic drivers, this change is what we're trying to facilitate. And it's challenging. We're not, without coal miners, there would have been no skiing. The coal miners created the energy that allowed us to build a lift. So we don't want to turn our back on all of this history. What we want to do, though, is work towards the future, you know, in a way that will not leave anyone out and that will work for everyone and will optimize. And so that's our challenge, is how do we make decisions about what to do? We can't do every use on every acre. We have to decide what we're going to, you know, we have to sort out which acres, and optimizing, having better systems for optimizing what would be best, whether we need a well pad there or we need a campground. That decision is what we're coming up with now. And right now, the resource extraction system really does have the upper hand, because there's so many laws and processes and systems that facilitate resource extraction, and recreation is sort of running along trying to catch up. So that, I don't know, that's kind of where we are, and which is lots of opportunity for change, but the changing needs need to be met by changes in the laws and how the agencies are operating.
Thanks, Ashley, and everybody else. I'm glad you brought up the Dingle Act. We're going to get to that in a minute and talk about Dingle Act, Great American Outdoors Act, and how that's going to affect this multi-use plan a little bit. But first, I really, you know, as you were talking, Ashley, I had this vision, or this sight in my head that was dividing up every acre of land to be like, all right, this acre is hunters, this acre is mountain bikers, this acre is for timber extraction, you know, whatever it is. So I want to ask Matt, you know, obviously that's not the strategy here for the BLM. So how do you manage for different users, like hunters, like ranchers, climbers, mountain bikers? You know, you can't just say, all right, here's your acre, here's your acre, here's your acre. Everybody's happy. Don't fight and don't cross boundaries. You know, how do you manage for this?
It is a struggle. It really is. But I really like what Katie said, is all these user groups want to use the land. They're all out there, and instead of putting labels on each other, if they realize how much they have in common, how much each one of them uses the land and loves the land, that is where we find common ground. So we try to balance that, and sometimes these multiple uses can coexist in a single area. And the best thing that we have is our planning. And I think Katie mentioned this too, is getting people to educating about when to comment, how to make substantive comments when the planning processes are happening, so their voices are heard. I think those are real important. The mechanisms for our planning are set up for the public to have feedback during these processes, and that's where we find these balances in the uses. They can try to coexist, but like Ashley said, and I forgot to mention in my remarks, but it's not every use on every acre, and we balance that. We have possible energy development over here, but then we also have conservation over here, and that's one of the things that the Dingle Act did give us, is areas to focus our conservation efforts. And coming up with those new designations, there's going to be planning efforts where it's going to be really crucial to have public comments on what the public wants to do with these landscapes, and have everybody at the table, not just recreationists, but everybody that's using this land, and hopefully people can start to understand that everybody wants to use this, but we just have to do it in a sustainable way that is best for everybody. But it's a juggling act, like I said before, and it's tough to find balance, and we can't always find balance. Sometimes we drop the ball, but that is the goal, is to be able to understand what people want to do with this land, but also balance it with the protection in mind too. So that if people come to the table realizing that they have more in common and they all love the landscape and they all use the landscape, that helps, instead of operating in silos where they're this group or that group or whatever it is. So there's going to be real opportunity soon in BLM Utah public lands to provide those meaningful comments.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I want to. There's two directions I want to go here, but first, since the Dingle Act keeps coming up, let's go that direction, and then we'll shift to kind of public comment and what you can do as an individual to be involved in that process. So this is open to anybody. What is the Great American Outdoors Act? I think I think everybody on here is probably familiar with that, and the Dingle Act maybe, but basically, what are these two pieces of legislation, and how does it affect the recreational use on these public lands, or moving forward that mission of shifting, the mentality, the importance of recreation on these lands as we do multi-use planning? How do these two pieces of legislation affect that?
Well, I'll start with the bad news, and then we can go to the good news. The bad news is they don't affect the conversation really. Well, the Dingle Act sort of does, because the Dingle Act, because it designated wildernesses and the recreation area, that was some guidance on what those acres should be used for. I mean, we basically decided we're not going to do oil and gas in the wilderness, and how it's going to be done in the recreation area, I think, is still a little bit questionable. But for the Great American Outdoors Act, it addressed some past problems of funding the backlog of national parks and funding the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And the outdoor community spent the last 400 years. No, I've gone to 4,000 meetings working on Land and Water Conservation Fund. And so that's going to free up a lot of political capital and opportunity for for people in the outdoor community to get involved in other aspects of outdoor management, now that we don't have to lobby for that Land and Water Conservation Fund every year. But the thing that neither of these did is reform energy development. So we really still have this big, the energy companies can nominate many, many places where we recreate. And you may assume that because there's a campground or a trail or a climbing area there, that, oh, well, that wouldn't be part of energy development, but it can be. And so we still have that to tackle. So that the bad news is it didn't solve everything. But the good news is it's a great start towards solving some of the problems, certainly the backlog. But, what we're seeing now is a lot of BLM and Forest Service offices really scrambling to keep up with demand for recreation. And so that's pure, straight up funding the agencies, which the Great American Outdoors Act didn't do. It funded the places. So those are the weak points, but there are lots of great points in terms of funding trails and recreation assets, and just keeping the Land and Water and having the Land and Water Conservation Fund being a reliable source that communities can depend on going forward. So that's the good news.
Anybody else want to jump in and talk about the effects of these two pieces of legislation?
I can jump in there. I'll try to focus on the glass being half full, Ashley, and and the positives and the good side of things if we can. But really good points too. But the Great American Outdoors Act, like you mentioned, it really is focused on improving our existing infrastructure and our backlog and deferred maintenance projects. So the BLM will get 5% of those for the next 5 years, and that can't hurt. It can only help. And then also the Lands and Water Conservation Act. So those are great things, and we're going to help to enhance our visitors' experience with improving that infrastructure. So baseline, it helps for now. And then of course the Dingle Act. It's an incredible resource down there in the Santa Fe Swell, not to mention Labyrinth Canyon and Desolation Canyon were designated wilderness areas, and portions of those river corridors, wild and scenic rivers. So all that is a really good thing down there in Emery County. And also the Swell recreation area. But like I mentioned before, the upcoming planning efforts for that. And there's also more to the Dingle Act too, that not just in Emery County. There's lands up in our Vernal Field office, the McCoy Flats Trail System, the John Wesley Powell National Conservation Area, and then also back in the Swell, the Jurassic National Monument. So those are all really good things to help us rethink of planning efforts in those areas. And those plans will be coming up in the near future to comment on, to hopefully hear from the public what they want to do with those incredible resources. So that's at least from a BLM Utah perspective, the benefits.
I'll piggyback on that, Matt, and say that from the communication standpoint, it's been so beneficial, because I think that these two pieces of legislation really were pivotal moments in activating folks on awareness of, the fact that this type of legislation exists, the fact that these outdoor issues exist, and that we are making decisions on them, and who is making decisions on them, and how we can have an impact. For the Outdoor Advocacy Project, our post about the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act is our all-time highest performing graphic that we've ever produced by like tenfold. And I think that it was a moment where folks really started to realize that, not only are these public lands available for us to use and love, but they are spaces where we can have an impact and where we can affect policy and legislation. And for me, the two of these pieces of legislation have been the rallying cries that have really activated folks and gotten people curious to learn more, and curious to become more politically activated within public lands, and understanding the complications and nuances of it as well. I keep calling it like an ecosystem or a web, and I think that diving into particularly the Dingle Act and seeing all the pieces and everything that went into it, and the conversations that had to be made, and the compromises that had to be made, I think really helped folks understand, or start to understand, the processes, and why you need to be so involved every step of the way, and seeing the impact that we can have.
From a tourism perspective too, it's been interesting. I've only been in this position for about a year and a half, and I think tourism historically is focused on obviously lodging tax dollars, because that's where this department comes from. But in a place like Emery County that doesn't have a lot of restaurants or bars or hotels or anything like that, in the Swell, I would say tourism is very new. They've really focused on mineral lease funds for a long time, and this is a big economic shift for them. And our focus in outdoor recreation is so huge that if we didn't focus on the education portion for outdoor recreation, people wouldn't know how to recreate here. They don't know what dispersed camping is. They don't know, where not to go and where to go. And
I think we lost Adriana.
I'm going to shoot her a quick email and just ask her to hop off and hop on.
And I'll add to where she was trailing off there about educating. That's one of the things that hopefully we can come up with these planning efforts, is the BLM to do a better job of educating the public of how to use the land and where to use the land. Because right now, she's right, there isn't a lot of information out there. And I think talking about all the visitation numbers that have increased during this, and all the new users that are using it's great. It's phenomenal to see more people out there, but we just need to do a better job of educating them about how their actions affect the land and other users while they're recreating, and other user groups like the ranchers or the hunters or anything like that, to make sure everybody is aware of the impacts their actions have on other user groups. So, sorry.
I think that education is really important, but I also think, oh look, Adriana's back. I think the thing that we have to recognize too, though, is that the land manager, this new wave of users, is putting the burden on existing land managers in an insane way. I mean, every campsite in Moab has been full all fall, and we have whatever 1.5 law enforcement officers for bajillion acres. Like it's really something that, and this is like the folks that work for the federal government are not allowed to lobby. So this has got to be our job to explain, to make the case for them, because yes, there's all kinds of things they can do, educate, law enforcement, better signage, all kinds of things, but not if they're running around doing the job of 10 people. And we're practically in that space right now. So yes, we should talk about all the great things that should be done, but then we're going to have to really work to find the resources to actually do those things. But Adriana, where were you going when you?
Yeah, before my computer decided to just totally fail on me for no particular reason, I was going towards just this kind of shift in the tourism world from market, fill up hotels, fill up areas. We're really kind of shifting towards a destination, we call it destination development perspective, and making sure that we're being proactive in the things that we do when we tell people to come out here, like where to dump, how to get involved, and how to learn why these lands are here for you and who else is using them, and things like that. Especially during COVID, the swell has seen a huge uptick in its recreation, and I do worry, to be honest, about our land managers and their ability to, just because of resources, their ability to manage these spaces, well, or with assistance, or actively. And the Wedge, the Little Grand Canyon, was just overrun come Memorial Day weekend, and they had to close camping on the rim. And they closed camping on the rim, and still, because nobody really understands what dispersed camping is, and they're making new campgrounds everywhere. And you can put signs up all day long, but if you don't have somebody who can actually go out there and tell people, hey, this is a new change, you're not supposed to be here, and until my department can dump marketing resources into telling people, hey, this isn't where you're supposed to be, people are going to continue to make those mistakes. And so it is a little challenging.
I think it's great to. Oh, sorry, Ashley. Let me jump in here and just add to what Adriana's saying. I think it's that relation between tourism and education and a little bit of and sustainability and this destination development. Utah is doing something, I think, in forward thinking of this, is in the sense that our grant fund that goes to building outdoor recreation infrastructure basically comes from tax dollars from tourism, right there, and I know that's a hard thing for people that work in the tourism industry to say, hey, I don't want to give up some of our tax revenue to people building trails. But we see such the close relation in Utah, and luckily our leaders are forward thinking to say, look, these dollars could go back to help this destination development process, forward thinking, as opposed to just trying to find these dollars elsewhere. But they found a direct correlation there, and that's been very helpful in getting these programs up and getting some of these, this infrastructure development to help assist in our public lands and developing trail systems and campgrounds and everything else moving forward. I want to, I want to jump in and lead to our last question, and I think everybody will have an opportunity to pitch in here, but you're already jumping the gun on my moderating. I don't know why I need to be here and talking about the heavy use during this past summer and during the pandemic, and the new users that we're seeing. So with that being known, right, our public lands are getting heavily used here in the state of Utah. And we know that education and getting involved is important if we want to protect them and help to balance this out a little bit. So how can someone get involved in how public lands are planned and managed? You know, how can you know, I tell my neighbor when they say, oh, I want to help I want to get involved with this. How can I, what resources do I lead them to, and how do I tell them to be involved? Katie, if you want to jump in first, is your expertise, and then anybody else, please share your knowledge as well.
Yeah, I definitely think this is a question with a lot of shared expertise amongst these panelists. The baseline for me, and something that I want to kind of turn back to that both Matt and Adriana have touched on, is this idea of understanding our role in this ecosystem first. So I think for recreation users, we put ourselves, if there were like two sides, and one side was timber and ranching and oil and gas, and the other side is conservation and wildlife. I think outdoor recreationalists would put themselves with the wildlife, with this vision that like we tread on the land as lightly as a pronghorn, but really we have a big impact on the land. We are an impactful user group. We do have bad impacts on the land. And I think understanding that is like the first step in shifting that perspective and the role that we play with this whole ecosystem. But then in terms of getting involved, it's, getting educated first, understanding what public lands means, what that is. And I think aligning yourself with a group or organization on a really localized level is what I found to be the most effective and impactful way to get people involved. So don't just send them, straight to like the Sierra Club or some big national organization that covers so many issues in so many places. Get really local. Think of the place that you love the most and figure out how you can contribute directly to that and get looped in with that organization. So if you're a climber, getting tapped in with Friends of Indian Creek. If you are a mountain biker, there's mountain biking organizations. Kind of figuring out your niche space and getting tapped in there and just really diving into the resources that are provided to figure out how you can learn about planning. If we want people to make public comments on a forest management plan, we need them to understand what a forest management plan is first. And helping folks understand how to participate in these comment periods is so key. We've really been navigating that with all the different systems that are available for putting in your public comment period, your public comment. Sometimes it's a very complicated, outdated website that folks need to navigate. Sometimes it's easier done through just a petition. Sometimes your comment really needs to be individualized and sent to a specific place. So providing those tools, I think, is the key part. And as much as it's important to like put people down the path of getting involved and making themselves heard, I think first it's the people in this chat room, if you will, right now that need to create that path for folks to be able to go down. And for me, that's a lot of distilling complicated language and public lands jargon into stuff that's understandable for folks. And really making it as easy as possible to put them down that path. We all know public comment periods can be quite a complicated space to navigate. And so just making it as accessible as possible and helping folks understand that their comments are counted, they are heard, they are important, they are valuable, and they do have an impact. Because I think right now a lot of folks have distrust in the government and public land management agencies. They just don't think that they're being heard or valued. And I think that we need to flip that script because, the public is important and does make an impact. And these are all of our public lands. I think everyone in this room would agree with that. And we just need to make sure that folks on the other side know that. I think we exist in such a bubble. And for us, we're like, yeah, public comment period. Obviously, super easy. I know what to do. But for the people that we need to hear from, they're on the other side of that bubble. And we need to figure out a way to let them know that there is a table that we are convened at, and there is a chair for them at that table, and that they are welcome to be heard.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important, and the public comment system is really important. But there's also just reaching out to your elected officials too, right? Which is also hard and kind of awkward, but really effective. When the mayor and the county commissioners understand these issues, that's where we're seeing real problems get solved in communities. But I want to go back to really quick that point that you made, Pitt, that for the longest time, the marketing department, tourism money and dollars and how that was spent has been really disconnected from the product department, right? Like there's this assumption that if you do the marketing, these public assets, the national park is just there. It's all set, ready to go. All we have to do is market it. Well, we've learned that that's not true, that all the marketing, if we do too much marketing and we don't invest in the product, we deliver a bad product, and that's bad for everyone. So meeting visitor expectations and sort of putting that business lens on it and saying, okay, this is what we have available here. This is what this community, these are the experiences available in this place. And so we know, as Katie was saying, that the folks doing the experiences are a little bit like focused on the experience, right? And they're not focused on the bigger picture. So providing ways for them to get involved is really important. But that point that these tourism dollars need to be invested not just in marketing, but also product development, i.e. the physical recreation assets on the ground, that still needs a lot of political support, that idea. So that's another place that letting your city and county officials know that you're concerned about investment and what's happening on the ground out there. Because even if you're educated, even if you know you're only supposed to camp in a dispersed, previously disturbed site and you know everything about it, if you're driving around from 7 to 11 o'clock at night looking for a campsite, it's a problem. And that's what we're seeing right now, is that, so it's not just education. Like, we've really got to look at putting resources into the system to make these experiences possible for folks. And because that's what we're seeing right now, is it's like, yes, we have a lot of new visitors to the outdoor space that don't know kind of the rules or the etiquette, but they're getting desperate because we aren't providing, so we have a lot of high-class problems to solve going forward, in that all these great people want to get outdoors, but we've got a lot of work to do to accommodate them in a way that will protect the resource and protect their experience and support the land managers.
Great. Thank you both for those comments. I think those are highly valuable, and it's more important than ever these days that we are getting involved. We're having these conversations, whether that's with local officials and leaders, getting involved with advocacy groups and educating yourself. All of these are important steps to make this happen. With just a little bit of time left, we're going to dive into a couple of questions that we have here in the chat feature. So, kind of going on those lines, Ashley was saying with marketing and the product that we're marketing here, how do we get OREC, outdoor recreation industry vendors and companies to help market the education? Obviously, there's a handful that are highly involved in that now. Patagonia, North Face, a lot of these larger corporations are getting heavily involved in funding and supporting a lot of actions towards this. Again, specifically, they're focused on recreation because that drives their bottom line. But it would be great to see some of these larger corporations be involved in the overall, multi-use planning aspect to really find a good balance for these lands. How do we get these businesses, to be involved in this, or how do we encourage that, or is there risk for these businesses to do that? How do we help? How do we get them to help with the marketing, basically?
I don't really have an answer for that because I haven't really tried it yet, but this beginning of summer, hearing the state park managers talk about how they're having to teach people how to dump their brand new camper because they bought it, took it off, thought it was an apartment, and forgot that they had all of these other things that they needed to manage in having a trailer. And And definitely some of the things that we realized is like, well, the only connection that they're having, especially right now during COVID, because they're not interacting with maybe a friend that also has a camper or something like that, is the retailer itself. And so, you know, we're currently doing our strategic plan, and so we're very much in our infancy, and it's felt really challenging with COVID and outdoor recreation, just like all of a sudden just ramping up like crazy. But it is something that, you know, as the tourism department, you know, these are impacts created because of, you know, travel and tourism. And so how can we help our area mitigate these impacts? And so, you know, reaching out to the businesses that sell these campers around here, and using research. I've had pit staff reach out to me and say, you know, who can we kind of collect data from? And once they collect that data, who can I reach out to based on that collaboration of data collection and, you know, what we've been thinking, and connect with these people and help them create material for people to take out and videos to show and stuff like that. That's definitely, you know, where my department could step in and say, let's create these promotional tools and these flyers and these events where people can engage with what they should be doing, or et cetera.
Katie, how about you? You've worked with multiple you know, trade organizations and in the outdoor industry in the past. You know, what is their view on this? And you know, is it a hot topic? Or are they not concerned if it doesn't drive revenue for them?
I've been sitting here wondering if I should share my opinion or not on this, because I think it is a little pie in the sky, but I truly believe in the value and the opportunity to create an outdoor industry and an outdoor community culture where we understand that, like, if you are making a profit off of public lands, which anyone who sells outdoor gear, is a guide, anyone in the outdoor industry is making a profit off public lands, you have a responsibility to protect that resource. And I know that that's just so, you know, ethereal or whatever, but I am such a firm believer in that. That is like my religious mantra is, you know, if you love the outdoors, you have a responsibility to do so. But I have definitely seen that's a lofty goal. And there is pushback, especially in the industry side. You know, folks are business minded. They connect everything back to their bottom line. So if you can get fancy with your language and kind of twist things around and convince folks that this is an action that will benefit your business, benefit the community that they live in, then, you know, I have seen good traction with getting folks to kind of get on board with that. But you really do have to understand the language that folks are speaking and be able to translate your goal into something that, you know, they connect with and that they feel motivated by.
And I was going to piggyback on that, and I think Ashley was alluding to this too, that at a certain point, the experience is degraded by the amount or the use type, and that's when you start to lose people's interest, or they get displaced, or they just don't enjoy it. They don't come back because that experience has been degraded at a certain point. So that affects the economy. And everything associated with the outdoor recreation industry. So that's something to keep in mind, is try to have that balancing act so the experience doesn't get degraded to a point that people don't come back and enjoy it.
Well, and also, I think it's not this responsibility to invest should not be placed wholly on the outdoor industry. Because while a lot of these companies are great brands, you know, they're not as big as Goldman Sachs or Adobe or these other major corporations that have moved to Utah because of our public lands. So there's a real opportunity to if we can move away from the caustic nature of the public land discussion in Utah, that will make it safe for these big corporations to get involved and to participate. And that's where we can find some serious partners who can help us both with education and messaging and investment in protection and the political will to support the agencies more. So I see that as a really big opportunity in the next few years. These companies kind of get it, but they haven't really been players yet. But I think that's changing, and that'll make a big difference in Utah.
Thanks, Ashley. And it's something that's been a focus for our office here in the last little bit, is how do we engage all the industries that are using outdoor recreation in our public lands as promotion tools, as quality of life tools for their employees, and things like that to help to support this, whether that's building out infrastructure, whether that's education, all of their ways that they, it helps us to really improve the experience and the use of our public lands. So we have we have a couple more great questions. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. I do encourage anybody to reach out to any of these panelists to ask these questions. I am interested in this one that Caitlin just threw out, that it says, how can agencies be involved in the agencies involved in planning, how can they develop safeguards that allow them to be a little more nimble to adjust for things like drought and fire and snowpack and permits and each year is different. Pandemics. How do we plan for or put a safeguard in so when a pandemic hits and we see a huge rush on our public lands? Something to think about, and I think maybe that'll be a future discussion, because I think that could be a lot of talk around what we do this. But great comments and great time. So I want to thank you all for being here. I'm going to turn the time over back to India to award somebody with a little prize for asking questions. But again, Ashley, Katie, Adriana, and Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to participate in this. And hopefully we can all work together to continue to improve and really educate ourselves and educate the public on the uses of our public lands and find a sustainable way that we can move forward and utilize it and really benefit from these public lands that we have in Utah. So thank you again. India, the time is yours. And thanks everybody for tuning in today.
Yes, huge thank you to the speakers again. I've got my hat quote to draw names from of those who asked questions, and we'll get you a prize. Flint Timmons, you are our prize winner. So we will make sure, I won't be in the office for a couple of days, but I will coordinate and I will make sure that we get you a prize. Thank you for asking a question. Please join us for other sessions. I know the topic of dumping came up a couple times, and we will have a November Summit Speaker Series on the Gotta Go Utah campaign, which includes trailers in addition to human waste. So stay tuned for information on that. And thank you all again for joining, and thank you to our speakers so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.